During my travels through America in the 1830s, I encountered a phenomenon that both fascinated and deeply troubled me. Americans possessed an extraordinary energy for personal achievement, yet seemed increasingly disconnected from their fellow citizens. They spoke constantly of freedom while unconsciously surrendering their civic power to distant authorities. This was not the healthy independence I had expected to find, but something far more dangerous: individualism masquerading as liberty. What I discovered was that democracy's greatest promise, the liberation of the individual, contained within it the seeds of democracy's potential destruction. Americans had created a society where each person felt sovereign over their private domain, yet powerless in the public sphere. They had confused withdrawal from civic life with personal freedom, not realizing they were constructing their own chains. This individualism, which Americans celebrated as their defining virtue, was in fact a false friend that threatened the very foundations of their democratic experiment. The paradox was striking. The more Americans retreated into their private concerns, the more they became dependent on centralized power. Without understanding it, they were creating conditions that could lead to a new form of despotism, one that would arrive not through violent conquest, but through the gradual atrophy of civic engagement. Chapter 1: The Deception of Democratic Equality. When I first observed American society, I was struck by how democratic equality had fundamentally altered the relationship between individuals and their community. In aristocratic societies, social bonds were clear, if often unjust. Each person knew their place and their obligations to others. The nobleman had duties to his vassals, the vassal to his lord, the craftsman to his guild. These bonds were often oppressive, but they created networks of mutual responsibility that held society together. But democracy had shattered these traditional connections, leaving individuals to forge their own paths through life. This transformation appeared liberating. Americans could pursue their own happiness without the constraints of hereditary rank or ancient privilege. A farmer's son could become a merchant's daughter could marry whom she chose, and anyone with talent and determination could rise in the world. Yet this very freedom created a subtle trap that few Americans recognized. When all citizens become equal, each person naturally focuses on their own small circle of interests. Why should one concern themselves with the welfare of strangers when everyone is supposedly capable of looking after themselves? The logic seemed unassailable. If we are all equally capable and equally responsible for our own lives, then mutual aid becomes unnecessary, even counterproductive. Each person should mind their own business and expect others to do the same. I witnessed this dynamic in countless American towns and cities. Citizens would gather energetically for commercial ventures or religious revivals, but showed little interest in broader political questions. They had internalized the belief that democratic equality meant each person was responsible only for their own success or failure. When the local newspaper reported on debates in the state legislature, citizens would shrug and return to their private affairs. When public improvements were proposed, they would calculate only their personal costs and benefits, not the broader social consequences. This seemed like healthy self-reliance, but it masked a dangerous withdrawal from the public sphere. Americans had begun to confuse equality of condition with isolation of responsibility. They believed that because they were no longer bound by aristocratic hierarchies, they were free from all social obligations beyond those they voluntarily chose. This was the first great deception of individualism, that democratic equality meant the end of interdependence rather than its transformation into voluntary cooperation. The deception was that Americans believed they were exercising their freedom when they focused exclusively on private concerns. In reality, they were abandoning the very civic engagement that made their freedom possible. Democratic equality had created the illusion that political participation was unnecessary, that the system would function perfectly well if everyone just minded their own business. This false understanding of freedom prepared the ground for what I came to see as individualism's most dangerous consequence: the gradual transfer of political power from engaged citizens to distant administrative authorities. When people stop participating in governance, governance does not disappear, it simply moves beyond their control and accountability. Chapter 2: The Tyranny of Private Concerns. What Americans failed to recognize was how their focus on private concerns was systematically undermining their capacity for political freedom. I observed citizens who could organize elaborate commercial enterprises or build impressive voluntary associations for charitable purposes, yet remained strangely passive when it came to fundamental questions of governance and law. They had developed remarkable skills for pursuing their individual interests, but had lost the ability to think and act as citizens. This retreat into private life created what I came to understand as a new form of tyranny, not the violent oppression of traditional despotism, but a gentle, pervasive control that citizens welcomed because it promised to manage public affairs without requiring their participation. Americans were so busy pursuing their individual interests that they gladly surrendered political responsibility to whoever promised to handle the complexities of governance. The mechanism was subtle but powerful. As individuals became more absorbed in their private pursuits, they lost the habits and skills necessary for effective political participation. They stopped attending town meetings, stopped following public debates, stopped engaging with fellow citizens about common concerns. Public life became something that happened to them, rather than something they actively shaped. When elections came, they might vote based on vague impressions or party loyalties, but they had lost the detailed knowledge and sustained engagement necessary for informed democratic choice. I witnessed this transformation in the evolution of American local government. Earlier generations had maintained active, participatory democracy at the township level. Citizens would gather regularly to debate road improvements, school policies, and local ordinances. They knew their representatives personally and held them accountable for specific decisions. But as commercial opportunities expanded and private concerns multiplied, citizens increasingly delegated local authority to professional administrators and distant state governments. They celebrated this as efficiency and progress, not recognizing it as the surrender of their most fundamental democratic prerogatives. Why waste time in long meetings when experts could handle things more quickly? Why argue with neighbors about complex technical issues when trained professionals could provide solutions? The logic was appealing, but its consequences were profound. Each delegation of responsibility to experts meant a corresponding loss of citizens' capacity to govern themselves. Each decision to prioritize private pursuits over public engagement weakened the networks of civic knowledge and relationship that democracy requires. Citizens began to see themselves as consumers of government services rather than authors of government policy. They wanted roads, schools, and public safety, but increasingly viewed these as products to be delivered by others rather than common goods to be created through collective action. The tragedy was that Americans genuinely believed they were preserving their freedom through this withdrawal. They confused the liberty to pursue private interests with political liberty itself. They did not understand that in a democracy, freedom requires active citizenship, that the price of liberty is not just vigilance, but continuous participation in the hard work of self-governance. Without this participation, even the most carefully designed democratic institutions become hollow shells, preserving the forms of freedom while losing its substance. This confusion created perfect conditions for what I termed soft despotism, a system where citizens retain the forms of freedom while gradually losing its substance through their own voluntary disengagement from political life. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Self-Sufficient Independence. Perhaps nowhere was individualism's deceptive nature more apparent than in Americans' belief that they could achieve complete self-sufficiency. During my travels, I encountered countless citizens who proudly declared their independence from all social obligations beyond their immediate family and business relationships. They saw this as the highest expression of democratic freedom, the ability to stand entirely on their own merits, owing nothing to anyone and expecting nothing from society beyond the protection of their right to pursue their own goals. This illusion of self-sufficient independence was particularly dangerous because it contained just enough truth to be convincing. America did offer unprecedented opportunities for individual advancement. A person's birth circumstances mattered less than their energy and talent. Social mobility was real, and many Americans had indeed improved their conditions through their own efforts. Unlike in aristocratic societies, where birth determined destiny, American society rewarded merit and industry. This created a powerful mythology of self-made success that became central to American identity. Yet this partial truth obscured a more complex reality. No individual, however talented or hardworking, succeeds entirely through their own efforts. They depend on laws that protect property, roads that enable commerce, schools that develop skills, courts that enforce contracts, and countless other collective goods that require sustained civic cooperation to maintain and improve. The successful merchant relies on public order, the prosperous farmer depends on transportation infrastructure, and the rising entrepreneur needs educated workers and stable institutions. By focusing exclusively on their personal contributions to their own success, Americans lost sight of their dependence on these shared foundations. They began to see government and civil society as unnecessary burdens rather than essential supports for their individual flourishing. This led to what I observed as a peculiar form of civic blindness, citizens who benefited enormously from collective institutions while simultaneously undermining those very institutions through neglect and hostility. I encountered prosperous businessmen who denounced public spending on education while employing workers trained in public schools. I met successful professionals who criticized government regulation while relying on public infrastructure and legal systems that made their success possible. They had convinced themselves that their achievements were purely private accomplishments, independent of any social contribution or obligation. The most troubling aspect of this illusion was how it made Americans vulnerable to manipulation by those who understood the real sources of power in democratic society. While ordinary citizens retreated into private concerns, political entrepreneurs and administrative specialists consolidated control over public institutions. Citizens retained the formal right to participate, but had lost both the inclination and the capacity to exercise that right effectively. I saw this dynamic playing out in American attitudes toward local governance, education, and infrastructure. Citizens wanted the benefits these institutions provided, but increasingly resented the taxes, participation, and compromise required to sustain them. They wanted public goods without public engagement, a contradiction that could only be resolved by transferring responsibility to distant authorities who promised to deliver services without requiring civic involvement. This created a vicious cycle. As citizens withdrew from public life, they lost understanding of how public institutions actually worked. As they lost this understanding, they became less capable of meaningful participation even when they wanted to engage. As their capacity for participation declined, they became more dependent on professional administrators and technical experts to manage public affairs. Each step in this process felt like a rational individual choice, but the cumulative effect was the systematic erosion of democratic self-governance. This false independence thus prepared Americans for a new form of dependence, one they would welcome because it promised to preserve their private freedom while relieving them of the burdens of citizenship. Chapter 4: How Equality Breeds Isolation. One of democracy's most paradoxical effects is how the pursuit of equality ultimately isolates individuals from one another. In my observations of American society, I discovered that democratic equality, while destroying artificial distinctions based on birth or rank, created new forms of separation that were perhaps more profound because they appeared natural and voluntary. The very conditions that made Americans equal also made them strangers to one another. When all citizens are theoretically equal, each person naturally compares themselves to their neighbors and finds either superiority or inferiority in specific circumstances. This constant comparison generates what I came to see as a peculiar form of social anxiety. Americans were simultaneously drawn to their equals and repelled by them, wanting to associate with those who could enhance their status while avoiding those who might diminish it. Every social interaction became tinged with competitive evaluation. This dynamic encouraged what I termed democratic envy, a resentment toward those who had achieved greater success, combined with fear of falling behind in the endless competition for advancement. In aristocratic societies, social differences were accepted as natural and permanent. A peasant did not envy a duke because the gulf between them was understood as unbridgeable. But in democratic societies, where differences appear temporary and surmountable, every disparity becomes a source of tension and motivation. Rather than fostering solidarity among equals, democratic equality often produced mutual suspicion and withdrawal into private spheres where individuals could feel secure from unfavorable comparisons. Americans developed sophisticated strategies for avoiding social situations that might reveal their relative disadvantages. They preferred to associate with people who confirmed their self-image rather than challenged it, creating social circles that reinforced existing inequalities while maintaining the fiction of universal equality. I observed this phenomenon in American social relationships, which struck me as both more fluid and more fragile than those in aristocratic societies. Americans formed friendships and associations easily, but these connections often remained superficial because they were based on immediate mutual advantage rather than deeper bonds of loyalty or shared tradition. When circumstances changed or interests diverged, these relationships dissolved with little regret or lasting obligation. The result was a society of individuals who were constantly in motion, geographically, economically, and socially, but who rarely developed the sustained relationships necessary for effective political cooperation. Americans became skilled at forming temporary alliances for specific purposes, but struggled to maintain the long-term commitments required for democratic governance. They could work together efficiently when their interests aligned, but had difficulty sustaining cooperation when immediate benefits were unclear or delayed. This isolation was masked by Americans' famous sociability and their talent for voluntary association. On the surface, American society appeared remarkably connected and cooperative. Citizens gathered for countless purposes: business ventures, religious activities, charitable causes, social clubs. They seemed always to be organizing, joining, participating. Yet beneath this activity, I detected a deeper loneliness, a sense that each person was ultimately on their own in navigating the challenges of democratic life. The difference was between instrumental and authentic relationship. Americans excelled at forming connections that served specific purposes, but struggled to create bonds that transcended immediate utility. They knew how to network, but not how to form lasting communities. They understood cooperation, but not solidarity. They could work together, but not genuinely belong together. The political consequences were severe. When citizens see themselves as isolated competitors rather than connected partners in a shared enterprise, they lose the capacity for the sustained cooperation that democracy requires. Public problems become someone else's responsibility. Political participation becomes a burden rather than an opportunity. Civic engagement withers, leaving the field open for those who understand how to manipulate isolated individuals for private advantage. Democratic equality, which promised to unite citizens in common dignity, had instead created conditions for unprecedented social fragmentation. Chapter 5: The Spiritual Emptiness of Pure Self-Interest. What troubled me most about American individualism was not its economic effects, but its spiritual consequences. I witnessed a society that had achieved remarkable material prosperity yet seemed increasingly empty of higher purpose. Americans had embraced what they called self-interest rightly understood, believing that the pursuit of personal advantage would naturally produce social harmony and individual fulfillment. This philosophy promised to solve the ancient problem of reconciling individual desires with social needs through the elegant mechanism of enlightened self-interest. This philosophy contained practical wisdom. It encouraged honesty, industry, and cooperation in commercial relationships. Americans understood that their long-term interests required fair dealing, reliable contracts, and peaceful resolution of disputes. They knew that building trust and reputation served their goals better than short-term exploitation. This created a society of remarkable commercial energy and innovation, where individuals could pursue their ambitions while contributing to overall prosperity. Yet it also reflected a profound spiritual impoverishment. When citizens understand themselves primarily as maximizers of personal utility, they lose connection to transcendent values that give life meaning beyond immediate pleasure and material accumulation. Everything becomes instrumental, valuable only insofar as it serves individual purposes. Religion becomes useful for maintaining social order. Morality becomes prudential calculation. Beauty becomes entertainment. Truth becomes information. Love becomes contract. I observed this spiritual vacuum in American attitudes toward religion, which served important social functions but often lacked the depth and authority that religious faith had provided in previous societies. Americans were nominally religious, but their faith was increasingly subordinated to their commercial and political interests rather than providing a higher standard by which to judge those interests. Churches became voluntary associations like any other, valued for their social benefits rather than their spiritual authority. The consequences extended far beyond personal fulfillment to the very foundations of democratic society. When citizens lack shared moral foundations that transcend immediate self-interest, they cannot sustain the mutual trust and sacrifice that democratic cooperation requires. Every political question becomes a zero-sum competition between rival interests rather than a shared search for justice and common good. Politics degenerates into mere bargaining between competing appetites. This spiritual emptiness made Americans particularly vulnerable to what I came to see as the false consolations of materialism and sentimentality. Unable to find meaning in higher purposes, they sought satisfaction in consumption and emotional experiences that provided temporary relief from the isolation and anxiety of purely individualistic existence. They accumulated possessions as substitutes for achievements, and cultivated feelings as substitutes for convictions. The marketplace became the primary arena for self-expression and identity formation. Americans defined themselves through their consumer choices: what they bought, where they lived, how they spent their leisure time. This created a culture of perpetual dissatisfaction, where happiness always lay in the next purchase, the next experience, the next opportunity for self-improvement. No achievement brought lasting satisfaction because no achievement connected to purposes larger than the self. Perhaps most dangerously, this spiritual vacuum created space for new forms of secular authority that promised to provide meaning and direction without requiring the moral discipline that traditional sources of authority demanded. Americans who had rejected religious and political authorities in the name of individual freedom often ended up surrendering their autonomy to commercial advertisers, popular entertainers, and bureaucratic experts who understood how to manipulate spiritually hungry but morally confused populations. I realized that true freedom requires not just the absence of external constraints, but the presence of internal resources, moral convictions, spiritual purposes, and social bonds that enable individuals to resist manipulation and pursue worthy goals. American individualism, by encouraging citizens to reject these internal resources as restrictions on their autonomy, actually made them more vulnerable to external control by forces they neither understood nor could effectively resist. The irony was complete. In the name of freedom, Americans were creating conditions for a new form of slavery, one that would be all the more effective because its victims would mistake their chains for ornaments. Chapter 6: Administrative Despotism, the Final Destination. The ultimate destination of unchecked individualism became clear to me as I observed the gradual expansion of administrative power in American society. What Americans celebrated as efficient governance was actually the construction of a new form of despotism, one that would arrive not through military conquest but through the voluntary surrender of civic responsibility by citizens too absorbed in private concerns to notice their political freedom slipping away. This administrative despotism would be unlike the tyrannies of the past. Ancient despots ruled through fear and violence, maintaining power by crushing resistance and terrorizing populations into submission. But the new despotism would operate through very different mechanisms. It would not rule through fear and violence, but through the promise of security and convenience. Citizens would retain formal rights while losing the practical capacity to exercise them meaningfully. They would be governed by vast networks of regulations and bureaucratic procedures that shaped their lives in countless ways, yet remained largely invisible and unaccountable to democratic control. I could see this future taking shape in American attitudes toward government administration. Citizens increasingly preferred to delegate complex social problems to professional experts rather than engage in the difficult work of democratic problem solving. They wanted schools, roads, and public safety, but resented the taxes, meetings, and compromises required to provide these goods through democratic processes. Why endure the frustrations of local politics when trained professionals could deliver better results more efficiently? This preference for administrative solutions over democratic participation created perfect conditions for the expansion of unaccountable power. Bureaucratic experts, insulated from electoral pressure and armed with claims to technical expertise, could implement policies that served their own institutional interests while claiming to serve the public good. They would develop their own logic, their own priorities, their own measures of success, all largely independent of citizen input or oversight. The process would be gradual and largely imperceptible. Each transfer of responsibility from citizens to administrators would seem reasonable in isolation. Each new regulation would address a genuine problem. Each expansion of bureaucratic authority would promise greater efficiency and fairness. Citizens would welcome each step because it relieved them of burdensome responsibilities while promising better outcomes. Yet the cumulative effect would be the systematic displacement of democratic self-governance by administrative management. Elected officials would increasingly become figureheads, managing the interface between citizens and bureaucracies but lacking real control over policy implementation. Citizens would vote in elections that decided broad directions but had little influence over the countless specific decisions that actually shaped their daily lives. The tragedy was that this transformation would occur with the consent and even enthusiasm of the governed. Citizens would welcome administrative despotism because it promised to relieve them of the burdens of citizenship while delivering the benefits of social cooperation. They would trade political freedom for personal convenience, not realizing that without political freedom, personal freedom itself would gradually erode as administrative authorities expanded their reach into previously private domains. I envisioned a future society where citizens lived comfortable but constrained lives, surrounded by regulations they neither understood nor could effectively challenge. They would have opinions about public affairs but no real influence over them. They would vote in elections that decided little of real importance while the actual business of governance was conducted by administrative agencies operating according to their own logic and interests. They would enjoy remarkable freedom in matters of personal lifestyle and consumption while losing control over the fundamental conditions that shaped their society. This soft despotism would be particularly dangerous because it would be difficult to recognize and resist. Unlike traditional tyranny, it would not create obvious martyrs or dramatic moments of oppression. Instead, it would gradually sap the energy and capacity for self-governance, leaving citizens free to pursue private pleasures while losing control over the public conditions that made private freedom possible. They would be governed by a power that was absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild, a power that would provide for their security and foresee their needs while gradually extinguishing the spirit of freedom itself. Chapter 7: The Path Back to Democratic Citizenship. Yet I do not believe this fate is inevitable. Americans still possess the institutions and traditions necessary to counter individualism's destructive effects and restore genuine democratic citizenship. The key lies in understanding that true individual freedom requires active participation in political community, that the choice is not between individual autonomy and social obligation, but between voluntary democratic engagement and involuntary subjection to unaccountable power. The path forward requires both institutional reforms and cultural transformation. The antidote to destructive individualism begins with what I observed as America's greatest democratic innovation, the art of voluntary association. When citizens come together to address common problems, whether building schools, establishing libraries, or reforming social conditions, they develop the skills and habits necessary for democratic self-governance while achieving practical goals that serve both individual and community interests. These associations serve as laboratories for democracy, teaching citizens how to deliberate, negotiate, and cooperate across differences of opinion and background. But voluntary associations must go beyond mere service delivery or recreational activity. They must become schools of citizenship that deliberately cultivate democratic capacities. Citizens must learn to see their participation in voluntary associations not just as pursuit of specific goals, but as practice for broader political engagement. They must understand that the skills developed in managing a community garden or organizing a neighborhood watch are the same skills required for effective democratic governance at larger scales. Equally important is the renewal of local democratic participation. Americans must rediscover the value of township democracy, understanding that participation in local governance is not a burden to be avoided but an opportunity to exercise genuine political freedom. Local participation teaches citizens that they can shape the conditions of their own lives through collective action, providing the confidence and skills necessary for effective engagement at higher levels of government. This renewal requires making local governance more accessible and meaningful. Citizens need regular opportunities for meaningful participation in decisions that affect their daily lives. They need clear information about local issues and accessible forums for debate and deliberation. They need to see tangible connections between their participation and actual outcomes. Most importantly, they need to understand that local democracy is not just about managing municipal services, but about maintaining the capacity for collective self-governance that democracy requires. The revival of democratic citizenship also requires a new understanding of self-interest that includes concern for the health of democratic institutions themselves. Citizens must recognize that their long-term individual welfare depends on the maintenance of political freedom, and that political freedom requires ongoing civic engagement even when immediate personal interests might be better served by withdrawal into private concerns. This means developing what might be called democratic self-interest, an understanding that individual flourishing ultimately depends on collective capacity for self-governance. This transformation requires education that helps citizens understand the connection between their private welfare and public engagement. They must learn to see civic participation not as sacrifice of personal time and energy, but as investment in the political conditions that make personal freedom possible. They must understand that democracy is not a machine that runs by itself, but a form of life that requires constant renewal through citizen engagement. Religious and moral education also play crucial roles in countering individualism's spiritual emptiness. Citizens need sources of meaning and purpose that transcend immediate material interests, not to restrict their freedom, but to provide the internal resources necessary for resisting external manipulation and pursuing worthy goals. This does not require any particular religious orthodoxy, but it does require recognition that human beings need purposes larger than themselves to achieve fulfillment and maintain freedom. Finally, Americans must develop new forms of political education that help citizens understand how democratic institutions actually work and why their participation matters. Too many Americans have been taught to see politics as a realm of corruption and conflict to be avoided, rather than as the arena where free people collectively determine their common life. They need to understand that politics, properly conducted, is not the opposite of morality but its highest expression, the means by which free people create just and flourishing communities. This education must be practical as well as theoretical. Citizens need to understand not just democratic principles, but democratic processes. They need to know how to participate effectively in public meetings, how to influence policy decisions, how to hold officials accountable, and how to build coalitions for constructive change. They need to see democracy not as an abstract ideal, but as a set of learnable skills for collective problem solving. The renewal of democratic citizenship is ultimately a cultural transformation that must occur in families, schools, churches, and communities across the nation. It requires Americans to rediscover the connection between individual liberty and collective responsibility, understanding that freedom is not something they possess privately but something they create together through ongoing civic engagement. Conclusion. The struggle against individualism's false promises is ultimately the struggle for democracy itself. Americans face a choice that will determine not only their own fate, but the future of democratic civilization worldwide. They can continue down the path of withdrawal into private concerns, gradually surrendering their political freedom to administrative authorities who promise to manage public affairs without requiring civic engagement. Or they can rediscover the connection between individual liberty and democratic participation, understanding that true freedom requires the ongoing work of citizenship. This choice cannot be postponed indefinitely. Each generation must actively choose democracy or lose it through neglect. The institutions and traditions that support democratic self-governance require constant renewal through the engagement of citizens who understand both the possibilities and responsibilities of political freedom. Democracy is not an inheritance that can be passively received, but an achievement that must be actively maintained. Americans still possess the resources necessary for this renewal. Their traditions of voluntary association, local governance, and civic engagement provide foundations upon which to build. What they need is the wisdom to recognize that their celebrated individualism, unless balanced by genuine civic commitment, leads not to freedom but to a new form of servitude, one they will have constructed with their own hands through their own choices. The time has come to unmask individualism as the false friend it truly is, and to rediscover the authentic freedom that comes only through democratic citizenship. The future of liberty depends on this recognition, and the courage to act upon it.